Season 3 of the hit Netflix show Stranger Things is about to kick off, and it's been a while since we were at Hawkins, Indiana. So let's run through what happened in Season 2. Now, the season starts out in Pittsburgh, and you have 4 people fleeing a building with alarms going off. They clearly stole something. They're all wearing masks, and now they're in a police chase. They're having trouble evading the cops, so finally one of them turns to a girl in the front seat and says, "Would you do something?" And she closes her eyes and just says, boom. And all of a sudden, the tunnel that they were going through completely collapses. And the cops now need to avoid that collapsed tunnel, so they turn into each other, forcing a car wreck. But the problem is, it was all in the cop's head. He gets out of the car, he's being chastised by his partner. "What the hell did you just do?" And it's because the tunnel is completely wide open. So this girl has some kind of power. And this girl's also connected to 11 somehow because she's bleeding from her nose, and when she goes to wipe off the blood, you see the number 008. All right, now we transition to Hawkins, Indiana, where it's Halloween time, and the boys are doing what every kid in the 80s did. They're trying to scrounge around some money to go play in the arcade. So the kids end up finding enough money, they end up heading to the arcade, and Dustin's playing Dragon Slayer, but he ends up losing. And he turns to Lucas and says, "Look, man, I still have the high score on Dig Dug." To which the employee of the arcade says, "You might want to check that." The kids immediately run over to Dig Dug to realize that the high score is gone. Somebody named Mad Max has overtaken it by like 50,000 points, which is a lot. They end up asking the guy that works at the arcade, "Hey, man, who the hell's Mad Max?" And like a true G, he says, "Look, I'll give you this information, but I want a date with Nancy." So the boys start arguing with the guy back and forth. And while this is going on, Will kind of wanders off. He ends up looking outside, and all of a sudden, he's in the Upside Down. There's a storm brewing, and he sees the Demogorgon. Now, Will ends up snapping out of it because of Mike, and they go back in the arcade, but it's clearly a sign, as we saw at the end of Season 1, that this thing is still following them around. But while Will has the Demogorgon, Hopper has this investigative journalist following him around. This investigative journalist is convinced that 11 is a Russian agent and a Russian superweapon. The problem is he's got some of the story correct. He knows about 11. He knows that there was a girl who was blowing out windows and stuff, but he doesn't have it all correct. And Hopper does a really good job of kind of laughing him off. But it's definitely troubling because somebody is starting to get to the bottom of this. And as soon as Hopper has the chance to get away, he does when he's called to go to a farmer's field that's been poisoned. So Hopper heads to this pumpkin patch, and the owner of the pumpkin patch is convinced that his rival has completely poisoned all of his pumpkins. And on first glance, these pumpkins are really messed up. They're completely destroyed. They're black. They have all these bugs flying out of them. And Hopper's listening to this, and he's willing to investigate it, but he's not buying the fact that the rival's the one who did it. Now we'll move on to Hawkins, Indiana's favorite couple, Nancy and Steve. They're sitting in Steve's car, and she's going over one of the essays for college for him. And all of a sudden, this new guy shows up. This is one of the new characters of this season. And to put it frank, the guy is the definition of like an 80s douchebag. He's driving a Camaro, I think. I don't know. I'm not really a car guy, but he's wearing the jean jacket, the acid wash jeans, the mullet. And you can just tell this guy is not the best, friendliest person in the world. But in the passenger seat, you have a little redheaded girl who gets out and skateboards over to the middle school. And obviously in the middle school, you have Mike, Lucas, Dustin, Will. And Will's having a little bit of a tough time because he just wants to live his life. But the problem is, and this is going to come as a surprise to anybody who's gone through middle school, the kids aren't being very receptive to the fact that he kind of came back from the dead. And they're putting like stuff in his locker like Zombie Boy and kind of making fun of him. But he just kind of throws it away. You can tell it's bothering him, though. But they head to science class, which is their favorite class, if you remember. And this new girl shows up. And she quickly tells the class that no one calls her Maxine, they call her Max, which leads the group to say, oh my God, that's probably Mad Max. The problem is, though, they're not quite sure if she's Mad Max. So what they do is they spy on her. And they just kind of follow around the blacktop, watching her. And as she's skateboarding, she throws something in the trash. And they, of course, run up to see what she threw in the trash. She threw out a note that said, "Stop spying on me, creeps." While they're kind of amazed that she could pick up on this, somebody from the school comes up to Will and says, "Hey, your mom's here to pick you up." Now, luckily, after this whole episode of Will dying and coming back from the dead, Will's mom's found a little bit of love. She's now dating a guy named Bob. He works at a Radio Shack, big tech-savvy guy. And she seems really happy with this guy, but now she's got to take Will to the doctor's office. The doctor's office isn't really in an office. It's more of like a laboratory. And I guess when you come back from the dead like Will did, you're not going to go to a just primary doctor. You're going to go to a higher tech doctor, and that's what happens because he ends up strapping up to brainwave machines. He ends up getting blood drawn, and in walks this new doctor. Now, the doctor's played by Paul Reiser, and nobody doesn't like Paul Reiser. Paul Reiser plays a great doctor, very friendly, asking about Halloween candy, what's his favorite. Doesn't give off a vibe of like an evil Dr. Frankenstein type. But he's asking Will about this latest episode in the arcade, and the wavelengths are going crazy. As he's asking Will about the Demigorgon, he says, I could tell it wanted to kill. And the doctor says, did he want to kill you? He says, no, everybody but me. While this is going on, the whole appointment is being watched by these guys in another room in black suits. These are clearly the guys who are responsible for this whole mess. After all this goes down, the doctor meets with Hopper and Joyce Byers and basically says, look, this is kind of normal. We're coming up on the anniversary. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Just act normal. Try to be there for him. Try to be supportive. So the doctor sends Joyce and Hopper on their way and then heads down in the basement where he watches these government workers strap up and start lighting the gateway or the Demigorgon, whatever you want to call it, start lighting it on fire. And it's having a reaction to the heat. So now we have confirmation that the doctor knows what's going on and he's kind of in on it. While all this is going on, however, Dustin and Lucas are on a hunt for Mad Max. They need to confirm that this girl is indeed Mad Max. So they stake out the arcade, and sure enough, she shows up, cursing her brother out. Her brother takes off. She rolls in the arcade, and they can confirm, yeah, her dig dug skills are legit. And also, they are smitten. The boys are heading back from the arcade, and Dustin heads into his house for the night. And after he's closed the door, you, the viewer, hear this rattle in the trash can. So something is clearly in there. But Will didn't go on this trip. He's sitting at home, and he's drawing a picture of himself as Zombie Boy. Jonathan walks in, sees it, and is trying to comfort him. But Will doesn't want to hear it. He starts freaking out at his brother, saying, look, everybody does this. Everybody acts like I'm broken, but I'm not. So Jonathan takes another approach and says, all right, well, then you're a freak. But you know what? No one accomplished anything being normal. Now, later that night, Nancy and Steve head to Barb's house, kind of keep up on her parents and see how they're doing and stuff. And when they show up, the house is for sale. The parents reveal to Nancy and Steve that they're selling the house because they want to pay for this investigative journalist they found to get to the bottom of what happened to Barb because the cops won't do anything. And that is the investigative journalist that was hounding Hopper about 11. And this really upsets Nancy because Nancy knows what happened to Barb, and she also feels a lot of blame for what happened to Barb. She's having a tough time with blaming herself for her friend's death. And also the fact that now her friend's parents are selling their house to pay for this investigative journalist to find out what happened to her. So after this heart-to-heart, it's movie night. And as they're watching the movie, and it's Will, Jonathan, Joyce, and Bob, the phone rings. And Joyce is still kind of on edge from everything that happened, I guess, because she kind of loses it. And Bob goes, look, don't worry about it. It's fine. But it's not all fine, because bells and whistles are going off in that laboratory where Will was doing his doctor's appointment. And look, they're probably not related. I'm sure nobody from the laboratory was calling Joyce, but something's up. The episode ends with Will brushing his teeth, but all of a sudden, he's back. He's back in the Upside Down. All right, on to episode 2. So in this episode, we finally find out what happened to 11. At the end of season 1, she's in the Upside Down, and she finds a way to get out of it. She goes through a portal in the school and ends up making it back to Mike's house. The problem is Mike's house is surrounded by federal agents, and they're all telling Mike, look, if you know where she is, you need to tell us now. 11 overhears this entire conversation, and she also overhears Mike say, look, I don't know where she is, but even if I did, I would never tell you guys, because I would never betray 11. And with nowhere to go, she ends up heading into the woods. She's kind of foraging and trying to survive, killing squirrels and stuff, and at one point, a hunter ends up spotting her, and she ends up taking him out, stealing his jacket. But eventually she finds that food that Hopper has left out for her, and eventually they do end up getting reunited because she tracks him down. We'll get more into her later, though, because right now it's Halloween in Hawkins, and the boys are going as Ghostbusters. All the boys show up at school dressed as different Ghostbusters, except 2 of them are dressed as the same kind of Ghostbuster. But then they have a bigger issue, and that is nobody in the school has dressed up for Halloween. They are literally the only kids that are dressed up in costumes, and they look like nerds. Not the best timing for when you want to approach Max for the first time and actually have a conversation with her, but that's what Dustin and Lucas are going to do. So they approach her and end up asking her if she wants to go trick-or-treating with them. It's pretty obvious they're kind of nervous. And while she admits to knowing what Ghostbusters is, she doesn't agree to go to trick-or-treating with them, and actually ends up giving kind of a sense that she isn't going to go trick-or-treating with them. But Will has a little bit of a problem, and that's the fact that his mother has found a picture of the Demigorgon that he's drawn. He tells his mom it's nothing, he's just working on something, but the picture lines up exactly with the outside of their house. So Joyce ends up bringing it to Hopper, and Hopper goes, look, it probably is nothing. We're coming up on the anniversary. I wouldn't sweat this too much. But you can tell Joyce doesn't sense that this is nothing. Now, at the end of the first episode, you saw the lab kind of in panic mode. There were sirens going off, there were buzzers, there were lights. And in episode 2, you finally get some answers as to what it was. Because one of the workers ends up entering the upside down and changing something in it. It seems to be kind of like a fuse for something they set up in the upside down. He ends up changing out that fuse and everything kind of goes back to normal. So that kind of gives an indication that all those bells and whistles at the end of the first episode were because a fuse blew in the upside down from something that they had put there. After they fix the whole fuse issue, the doctor ends up going into another room and re-watching his interview with Will. Much like a football player would watch game tape. But at least Will made it out because Barb was not so lucky, and Nancy's going through a real tough time dealing with the fact that Barb is dead. And she's really putting a lot of the blame on herself. We saw it at the end of episode 1. It continues on in episode 2. She ends up approaching Steve, wanting to go to the cops and admitting that basically they ended up killing Barb, and Steve's like, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. We didn't do that, and we really shouldn't blame ourselves for it. There's a Halloween party that night, so he goes, look, let's just go to the Halloween party and act like stupid teenagers for once. We'll get back to Barb and the guilt that Nancy's feeling in a little bit, but I do want to update you on that farmer who had his crops all torn up. Now, that farmer had blamed his rival for doing it. And guess who shows up at the police station? None other than the rival. And you're not going to believe this, but the rival is claiming the first guy did it. So Hopper's listening to all this. He's looking at the pumpkins. The pumpkins look exactly like the same from the first farm. And then the guy says, yeah, he didn't just stop with me. He did it to everybody's farm. So now Hopper's really, really curious. And he ends up going to the farm and looking, yep, it looks exactly like that first farm. And whatever it was that poisoned this goes really far back into the woods. The slimy stuff all on the trees doesn't look at all like poison. And Hopper starts telling the guys, all right, map out exactly how far back it goes. In this episode, we also get a look at the relationship between Max and her brother Billy. They moved here from California, and Billy is screaming at her, whose fault is it that we're in this shithole of a town? And you can tell Max is like, well, it's your fault. And this really triggers Billy. It's pretty obvious Billy didn't want to leave California for Hawkins, Indiana, and while they're driving along, they come across the boys who are just on the street with their bike. Billy ends up indicating that he's going to hit the kids, and at the last second, Max ends up moving the steering wheel so that obviously the kids don't get hit. But this gives you a clear indication of what kind of an asshole Billy is. A, the fact that he's blaming this little girl for having to move to Hawkins, Indiana, even if it is her fault, still, dude, come on. And 2, the fact that he's willing to even joke about hitting children on bicycles. Well, look, now it's time to go trick-or-treating. And unlike in school, everybody's wearing costumes, so you're not going to be a freak tonight. Now, Jonathan has been tagged with watching over Will. And as they drive to Mike's house to meet up, Will kind of begs Jonathan to just let him go. Look, man, nobody else's big brother's going to watch them tonight. Just let me be a kid. So Jonathan obliges and says, look, I'll pick you up at 9:30. Go have fun, but be safe. So Will gets out. He's armed with a bag to hold the candy and also Bob's camcorder. You gotta remember, this is new technology. It's exciting. Back in the 80s when these things came out, you were videotaping everything. So as the boys are going around, all of a sudden out of nowhere, somebody pops out holding a fake knife and a mask and scares them and ends up being Max. And this is like the first indication that Max actually wants to be friends with these guys. And they're really taken aback that she's even there. But she goes, come on, I heard this part of the block has like full-size candy bars. But the one person that is not excited to see Max is Mike. Mike wants nothing to do with Max. So while the kids go off and trick-or-treat, Jonathan now has some time to kill, and he's going to go to that party that Nancy and Steve are at. And Nancy is getting turned up. She's still harnessing that guilt about Barb, and she is getting shit-faced. And when people get shit-faced, they do stupid stuff. Nancy's obviously over-drinking, and Steve's trying to have her calm down. And while they tussle over a drink, she ends up spilling it into her shirt. Nancy ends up heading upstairs to clean it off, and her and Steve end up getting into a huge fight. She basically says that everything Steve does is bullshit, Steve is bullshit, and that their relationship is bullshit, and she doesn't love him. And this forces Steve to be like, all right, well, screw you, I'm out. And he storms out of the party. The problem is Nancy's still intoxicated, and Jonathan just showed up, and I think we all know that Jonathan's got a huge thing for Nancy. So he ends up making sure that she gets home okay. But while all this is going on, Will ends up having a little bit of an episode. While trick-or-treating, these older kids pop out of nowhere and call him Zombie Boy and scare him, and he falls back, and you see it through the camcorder that he gets knocked over. And when he gets knocked over, he goes in the upside down. He ends up getting snapped out of it, but these episodes are becoming more frequent. Mike ends up saying, look, I'll take him home because this is lame anyway, and I don't want to be here. But he doesn't want to be there because of Max. One kid, unfortunately, who can't go trick-or-treating is 11. 11 is stuck in the woods in this little cabin, and she's not allowed to leave. And her caretaker is Hopper, who's now running late to go meet up with her. Hopper ends up eventually coming home, but 11 is pissed off. She's hiding in another room with the door locked and a TV in there, and Hopper's, kind of begging for forgiveness. Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I got you candy. But she doesn't want to hear anything of it. And she puts the TV on static, puts a blindfold on, and I can't really say she goes in the upside down, but she definitely goes in another dimension. And what she ends up hearing is Mike. Now, when Mike took Will home, they ended up confiding in each other. These episodes keep happening, and Mike says, well, 11 would know what to do. And it's clear that he really misses her. And the thing that 11 sees when she goes in this other dimension is Will trying to contact her. The bond that those two share is not gone. When she comes out of this episode, her nose is bleeding and she's crying, but that's probably why Mike constantly feels like she's still there. The episode ends with Dustin coming home, hearing that rattling in the trash can, opening up and just saying, holy shit. In episode 3, we find out that the thing that Dustin found in his trash is this little slug-like thing that he's never seen before. So he ends up putting it in a terrarium and feeding it 3 Musketeers bars, which he really likes. But what he doesn't like is the heat lamp, because when Dustin puts it on him, he shudders in pain and kind of hides from it. So because of the 3 Musketeers bars, he calls it D'Artagnan. That's one of the 3 Musketeers. And Dustin thinks, hey, I found myself a new pet. We also get a look into the backstory of how 11 and Hopper ended up being reunited. She ended up searching him out after she found the Eggos that he had left for her. He ends up taking her to a cabin that was owned by his grandfather, but it hadn't been used in years. So they cleaned it out, and now she's got a home where Hopper can protect her. The problem is, Hopper's kept her there for about 350 plus days, and she is pissed. She's getting stir-crazy, and to make it worse, Hopper's promised her that eventually she will see Mike. He keeps saying soon, 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 but she's taking mental note of this, and she's wondering when soon will actually be today. But the new 11 in the group, we'll call her that because she kind of is Max, and Max is very interested in what the hell's going on with Will. So Lucas tells her the story, but kind of waters it down, and it's an unbelievable story, and he says, no, it's true. Like, you can ask anybody, just don't ask Will. He's very sensitive about it. Max clearly does not buy this. Right afterwards, they go to science class, and the teacher's telling them a story about this famous guy who had a rod through his head. And when this happened, he survived, and he was fine, but his personality had completely changed, and it's a lot like Will. Now, Dustin is also in that class, but he's shown up late. Dustin checked out every book in the library. I say that, but really, he stole them all to find out exactly what Dart is, and he hasn't shown any of his friends, so he shows up for the class late. He apologizes to the teacher, but he also says, hey, we got to meet in the AV room right after this class because I have to show you something, and he shows them Dart. Now, all Dustin cares about is getting credit for this discovery. He has no idea what it is, and Dart isn't matching up in any of the books to anything. It'll have one thing, but it won't have another. It'll have this thing, but it won't have that. It doesn't match up. Now, immediately, Will ends up noticing this thing because it looks a lot like the things he threw up at the end of Season 1. In fact, that's pretty much exactly what it is. Will secretly goes off and tells Mike about, hey, what I think Dart is, and Mike runs in and intervenes Dustin from showing the science teacher what it is before he can. So the science teacher never sees what Dart is, but it's honestly probably for the best. Now, we'll get back to them in a moment, but let's get to Hopper, who's still trying to figure out what the hell happened to the crops. So he ended up having everybody put the tiny flags down to indicate how far this thing went back. He ends up circling it on a map and realizing that it pretty much all leads right back to the lab that they take Will for his doctor's appointments. So Hopper ends up heading to the lab, and you end up learning that Hopper knows what's going on. He's aware of all the experiments, and he has a big blow-up with the doctor who's saying, hey, nothing is leaking out in a Hawkins. And Hopper says, look, I'm allowing you to do this. I'm keeping it under wraps. So get a team out there, test the soil, and guarantee me that what is killing all these crops is not coming from you guys. Well, while Hopper's trying to figure this out, Eleven's just gotten tired of it. She's not sitting around watching TV anymore. She's leaving the house, and she breaks the one big rule that Hopper has, which is don't leave the house during the daylight. Hopper obviously wants to protect her, and she obviously is an adolescent kid who's not understanding. But she takes off. While walking around, she comes across a mother and her daughter on a swing set, and she asks, hey, where's the school? And the mother says, are you lost? The school's that way. And 11 ends up using her powers to make that swing go around and around and around really fast and tie it up. And then she takes off for the school. She also has a flashback of Hopper telling her a bedtime story. And there's a mother in this bedtime story, and she asks, do I have a mother? And Hopper says, of course you have a mother. So she's clearly having some issues with the fact that she has a mother, she doesn't know who her mother is, and she's never met her mother. And now she's seeing a mother bond with her daughter, and she's never had that. Now, over at the high school, Steve is getting worked by Billy, the douchebag kid, in basketball. I mean, Billy's just taking him to town. And in the middle of the game, Nancy shows up wanting to know what the hell happened last night. She can't remember anything, and she's convinced that Steve took her home. And Steve goes, no, I didn't take you home. Jonathan took you home. So why don't you go check with him of what happened? And then Steve just breaks down everything that she said, and it's pretty clear that he really took this stuff to heart. So Nancy goes and checks with Jonathan, and he goes, yeah, I took you home, but I was asked to take you home, which is a lie, and I just wanted to make sure you got home okay. And then Nancy ends up saying, this is terrible. I can't believe I said these things to him. What happens if I meant it? And somehow this conversation ends up transforming into what happened with Will and the burden that Nancy's carrying around about Barb. Nancy says, yeah, but Will came back. And Jonathan shoots back, yeah, he did, but he's a different kid. And Nancy says, doesn't that piss you off that these people basically got away with this? And Jonathan says, yeah, but those people are dead. And Nancy goes, come on, you can't be that naive. You really think that they're dead? And then the light bulb goes on, and she says, hey, doesn't Bob work at Radio Shack? Do you want to skip third period? So they take off, and they go to Radio Shack for what we don't exactly know yet. But Bob isn't at Radio Shack as he's having lunch with Joyce, and he says, hey, by the way, not that it's a big deal, but my camcorder was a little banged up when I got it back from Will and Jonathan from Halloween, and I watched the tape, and there were just some older kids kind of making fun of them. And being the mama bear that she is, she wants to see this tape. So she ends up hooking up the camcorder to her TV, and she ends up seeing the kids knock down Will. And then she sees Will get up and just start walking towards this thing, and she notices something on the TV, and it looks really familiar. So she goes, grabs a piece of paper, starts tracing what she sees, and it ends up being the shadow monster / Demogorgon, whatever you want to call it, but that's what she sees on the TV. So let's get back to the kids at school, though. They have the whole dart situation going on, and Max is with them. Max is going to end up having to skate home from school because she's running late. Billy's not going to wait for her. Billy's in the car with another girl who says, don't we have to wait for your sister? And he says, don't call her that. She's my half-sister. So this gives you a pretty good idea of why their relationship isn't copacetic. But she's been kicked out of the room because the group wants to discuss exactly what DART is, and she still doesn't know the full extent of 11 and what happened last year. So while they're discussing exactly what DART could be, he literally grows legs right in front of them. And when this happens, Mike tries to attack him, but he ends up jumping off the table and running out of the room. He's able to get out of the room because Max was trying to lockpick, and it ended up just being perfect timing. She opens the door to get in the room, and DART runs out. And now they're on a manhunt to find where DART went. Now, on top of all of this, 11's arrived in the school, completely unbeknownst to them, and she's not going to make herself seen. She's on the hunt for Mike because she's been promised she's going to see him. But word has gotten to Hopper that 11 is out. The mom of the daughter called the cops and said this little girl made the swing go around. And immediately Hopper knows that, yep, 11's escaped. 11 eventually does come across Mike, who's talking to Max as Max skateboards around the school gymnasium. And Max just asks him, why do you hate me so much? And he says, I just find you annoying. We don't need you around. And just flat out tells her, we don't need a replacement for 11. And Max goes, I don't know who the hell 11 is. When she says that, 11, standing there watching this go down, hearing what she's saying, ends up ripping Max with her powers off the skateboard. When this happens, Mike tries to help her out and says, hey, what happened? And she goes, I don't know, I just felt like something pulled me off of it. And this gives Mike the indication that 11 is near. He's had this feeling before, and now it's happening again to somebody else. So while Mike is now on the hunt for 11, the rest of the group is on the hunt for Dart. And luckily, Will has found him. He's found him in a bathroom stall, and he radios to the group, hey, I found Dart. And while he's got Dart cornered, Dart screams at him, and it scares Will, and he runs outside. And when he runs outside, he trips, and he runs right into the Upside Down. Now, earlier in the episode, Bob is telling Will about this monster that he used to have in his head, and how he got over this monster was when this monster would appear to him in dreams, he finally just stood his ground and said, go away. Get out of here. I'm sick of you. And Will tries that same approach with the shadow monster / Demogorgon. He stands there, doesn't run from him, and basically yells at him to go away. But the shadow monster doesn't go away. And it completely engulfs Will. It goes into him, and it's pretty clear that Bob's little plan has completely backfired. So episode 4 starts out right where episode 3 left off, but Will has actually made his way outside, and he's still dealing with this episode. The shadow monster is still going into him, but of course nobody outside knows that. And Joyce is showing up, trying to snap Will out of this. Eventually he does snap out of it, and Joyce takes him home, and he's telling her, I don't remember anything that happened, but she doesn't believe that at all. She says, look, I'm not going to take you to the doctor or the lab, but I need to know if something's wrong so I can fix it. I saw this drawing that you did, and I saw the same thing on this TV. So what's going on? And Will kind of breaks down and says, yes, that's the same monster that I saw in the arcade. And look, I just want this thing to go away. And she reassures him that nothing will ever hurt him ever again. And he just wants this thing to go away, and he doesn't know why it's still in him. But while they're having a heart-to-heart, Eleven and Hopper are having a huge blow-up. Hopper's got her back in the cabin, and they're both arguing because Hopper sees it like, look, I put these rules in place to protect you, and Eleven sees it like, well, you told me I was going to see my friends. I never saw my friends. It's been almost a year. When can I see my friends? They're both very angry at each other for not understanding the other's viewpoint. He ends up trying to ground her. She uses her powers. He ends up taking the TV away, and she eventually kind of just destroys the house with her powers. But let's get back to Will, who is not going to go to school because he's not feeling well, and Joyce says, look, I'm going to make you a bath, but the problem with the bath is it's too hot. And Joyce says, I can cool it down a little bit for you. And he says, no, it likes the cold. This is a clear indication that there is something truly inside Will. Now, in a previous episode, Hopper said, hey, if anything happens, contact me first. And that's what Joyce is trying to do, but she's not having any luck because Hopper is dealing with 11. But finally, the police dispatcher gets in touch with Hopper and says, look, you got to go over there. She's called me 7 times. So when Hopper goes over there, Will ends up explaining to him exactly what's going on. And Will's trying to explain to him everything that's going on, but it's really tough to convey it with words. So Hopper ends up noticing all these pictures that he's drawn, and he's a really good artist. And he says, well, what if you don't have to say it? What if you just draw it? So Will is frantically drawing on any piece of paper he can find. And initially, it just looks like scribble. But it's not scribble, and we'll get back to that in a bit. Because the fact that Will is out from school has his group of friends kind of concerned. They end up having a meeting, and they end up excluding Max, of course, because Mike's kind of a dick. And this results in Max freaking out at Lucas, saying, I thought you guys wanted me to be a part of your group, but you exclude me from everything. She ends up leaving with her brother, who scolds her for hanging out with a black kid. He doesn't quite say that, but he alludes to it. He's truly a piece of shit. Now, while Max seems to be the new 11, the old 11 is stuck cleaning up the cabin that she's destroyed. And while she's doing this, she ends up finding boxes in the attic that just says Hawkins Lab on it. Upon further investigation, she ends up finding a bunch of files and a bunch of news clippings. The news clippings are of a woman who is pictured with Papa and who claims that her baby was taken from her. It's not hard to figure out who the baby is. 11, wanting to see what this woman's up to, does the same thing she did with Mike a couple episodes ago. She ends up putting a blindfold on and kind of visiting her in this, like, empty space. And the woman is older. She's sitting in a rocking chair, and she's talking to herself. But the difference between this woman and Mike is this woman notices her and actually calls her by her real name, which is Jane. 11 reaches out for her mother, but as soon as she does, her mother just kind of disappears. 11 is left just crying her eyes out, screaming for this mother who isn't there. But let's get on to Nancy and Jonathan, because Nancy and Jonathan are armed with a recorder, and they're sitting in a park, and they're waiting for somebody. We don't know exactly who, but they can kind of tell that they're being watched, so they quickly try to get out of there because they're spooked, and the guy that's watching them comes up to their car and says, hey, are you having car trouble? And all of a sudden, they are surrounded by 4 people. Those 4 people usher them over to the lab, where they end up meeting with Will's doctor. Now, initially, they're held against their will, and they are pissed off. But to the doctor's credit, he comes clean. He says, yes, look, your friend is dead, and that's a tragedy. But the people that were responsible for that, they're dead, and I'm in charge now. And if you want to see what killed your friend, I'll gladly show you. And he calls the monster a mistake. And he shows them the thing that's living under the lab that they end up burning. But he pleads with them to keep their mouth shut because he says, look, while this is a mistake, if word of this gets out, do you think the Russians will think it's a mistake? In fact, they might even try to replicate this and weaponize it. He also adds that he's looking at this monster as a weed, where you can't kill it, but you can stop the spread. And they do that by trying to burn it. And Nancy and Jonathan end up getting kicked out of the lab. Hey, have a great day, on your way. But the whole conversation was being recorded. And Nancy has absolutely no plans of keeping her mouth shut. All right, now let's get back to Will, whose drawings have ended up connecting into kind of like a map. And Will alluded to Hopper earlier that it's more of a tunnel, not a map, and Hopper puts 2 and 2 together and realizes this is connecting with all of those crops being burnt. So Hopper ends up heading out to the burnt crops and digging, and sure enough, he finds a tunnel underneath Hawkins. And he stupidly decides it's a good idea to go in. And that is how episode 4 ends. Real quick, though, I do want to get into Dart, who has gotten a lot bigger to the point where he's eaten Dustin's mom's cat. All right, on to episode 5, where Joyce is trying to figure out exactly what the drawings that Will made are. But while she's doing that, Will and Mike are having a conversation, and Will is telling Mike, I feel like this thing is inside of me. And while I can still see, obviously, the outside world, it's weird because I can also see what he sees. And Mike, being a good friend, decides to try to spin this and say, well, that's great, because then you can be like a spy. You can be like a covert agent and try to disrupt what he does. And while that's a good point, Will says, but what if this thing does that to me? What if it ends up spying on me? So while Mike is trying to comfort his friend, Mike's sister, Nancy, is with Jonathan trying to take down the people that are in charge of killing her friend Barb. She's got the tape recorder that she snuck into the lab and had the doctor basically admit everything. And her and Jonathan are going to go find that investigative journalist that Barb's parents hired. It's a little bit of a drive, so they end up staying overnight at a hotel. And they kind of have a conversation of like, why didn't we ever become a thing? And Nancy says, you know, I waited for you. And he says, yeah, like a month until you went off and got back together with Steve. I had to deal with Will. And that was the wrong thing to say, because she just turns over and Jonathan got none that night. But eventually the next day they end up getting that investigative journalist's house, and they end up playing him the recording of the doctor. And they say, all right, is this enough to take these guys down? You hear them admitting it. And he goes, look, I believe you. But it's not about getting me to believe you. It's about getting everybody else to believe you, because this is an unbelievable story and not a lot of people are going to buy it. And then the light bulb goes on and they realize all we have to do is water down this story to make it believable. Like a 3 Mile Island type thing, and blame this lab for what happened to Barb. So that's the new plan. They're going to make up a story that's believable and send it to the news stations with the audio that explains what happened to Barb to take these guys down. Now, in the last episode, Max had a big blow up at Lucas for basically not including her in the group. She just wants to blow off some steam like any kid in the 80s. She heads to the arcade, but there's an out of order sign on the Dig Dug machine. And the guy that works there says, hey, I've got a machine in the back. You can use that. And when she goes back there, there's Lucas. He says, look, this is the only way I could get to talk to you because you weren't going to talk to me any other way. And he comes clean with everything that happened to 11, their true story. And while she enjoys that story, she doesn't believe it at all. And as they leave the back room, she's making fun of the entire story. Oh, these agents are going to come get me. And he keeps saying, watch your mouth, keep it quiet. And she keeps on with it. And he really gets pissed off and literally puts his hand over her mouth and says, stop talking about it. And that's when she starts to believe, oh my God, this story might be legit. But she wants proof. Unfortunately for her, she's not going to get that proof because Billy has shown up to pick her up. And when Billy sees that she was talking to Lucas, he scolds her for it. So Mike and Will are together. Lucas is trying to convince Max that the thing that happened with 11 is real. And then you've got Dustin, who can't get a hold of anybody and has a huge Dart situation. But luckily for him, he was able to trap it in his basement. But then there's 11, who just found out that she does indeed have a mother. And with Hopper gone, she ends up hitchhiking and finding exactly where this woman is. She finds a woman in a rocking chair in basically a vegetative state, just repeating the same couple words back and forth. The woman's caretaker, who I'm assuming is going to be her sister, which would be 11's aunt, is trying to figure out where this little girl came from. It's kind of weird when a little girl shows up and just says, I want to see Mama during the day, during school hours. In October. Yeah. So the lights start flickering and the woman says, oh, that's just the electricity, kind of gets on and off sometimes. And 11 goes, no, it's not. It's Mama. So 11 wants to talk to her mother and she puts that blindfold on and goes in that place that, like, I mean, to best describe it, it's like the sunken place from Get Out. And she finds out exactly what happened to her mother. 11's mom was working at the lab, and when she had 11 was taken from her. This really sent her off the deep end. She got a gun, she infiltrated the lab, and she tried to basically get her daughter back. She does end up locating 11 in basically a nursery room with another girl, and we're led to believe that that girl is the same girl from the first episode of this season, who also had powers. But eventually security came, grabbed her, hooked her up to an electric machine basically, and zapped her brain. They cranked it all the way up, and they've put her in this vegetative state. By the way, the person who orchestrated this was the person that 11 called Papa. 11 ends up finding out that those same couple of words that just she keeps repeating over and over are things that she saw the day she tried to get 11 back. So everything that this woman's saying, even though it sounds like gibberish, actually has a purpose. Now, let's get back to Will and his drawings. They don't know exactly what these drawings are of. So Joyce ends up getting some help from Bob, who's a pretty smart guy, and Bob actually figures out, oh, this is a map under Hawkins. And they start getting an actual map and lining it up to try to find out exactly where Hopper is. Because Will can see that Hopper is down in these tunnels and is in trouble. Hopper's basically being engulfed by these snakes, slugs, the weird monster thing. And he's in trouble and needs to be found ASAP. Now, while all this is going on, the lab has gotten the soil samples back from the farm. And while it looks like normal samples, when you put heat on that soil, it starts spinning around and reacting to it. So clearly, this is coming from the lab. It does have a reaction to heat, just like Will, just like the shadow monster. And because of that, time is obviously of the essence to find Hopper. Luckily for Hopper, Joyce, Bob, Will, they realize exactly where he entered and where he is, and they rush to that location. And when Joyce and Bob find Hopper, he's pretty close to death and being suffocated by these things. But just as they're ready to free him, government workers rush in, quickly usher them out, and just start lighting this thing on fire. The problem is, when they start lighting this thing on fire, Will immediately starts convulsing. Will is in extreme pain because if the monster's on fire, Will is now on fire. And that's how that episode ends. So on to episode 6. So this episode picks up right where episode 5 left off. The feds have Hopper and they're washing him off, trying to decontaminate him, and they've put Will in the hospital. And while Will sits in the hospital, his mother is screaming at the doctors. She wants to take her son to an actual doctor, and they're saying, whoa, don't do that. This is the best place for him. And she's saying, hold the phone. What have you done for my son? You haven't done anything for him. He's not getting better. In fact, he's getting worse. So while Will sits in the hospital, the main doctor wants to show Hopper what's been happening under the lab. So he puts a hazmat suit on him and says, hey, follow me. And as they go in this hole that's been dug in the basement of the lab and they travel down, you realize that they're literally in kind of the beast. The doctor brings up that every living organism adapts to survive, and this one's no different. And it's been growing under them like a cancer the entire time. Once Hopper and the doctor reach the floor, they see all of these tunnels. So Hopper says, hey, why haven't you been burning this thing? And the doctor says, well, there's a complication. Obviously, the complication is when they burn this thing, Will ends up freaking out like he's dying. And speaking of Will, he's woken up, but the problem is he doesn't remember some things. He doesn't remember Hopper, he doesn't remember Bob, and when the doctor asks him, hey, do you remember anything of last night? He says, yeah, I remember stuff. I remember soldiers trying to attack me and hurt me. And then he says, he didn't like that. You guys shouldn't have done that. You made a big mistake. He obviously being the Demigorgon. The doctor decides to do an experiment, and he brings one of the pieces, those little snake things, slug type things, that was attacking Hopper. He brings that into the room, and he wants to see if burning these things ends up correlating to the pain that Will was feeling. And sure enough, when they put flame to it, Will ends up freaking out, confirming that, yes, this thing is in Will, and if you attack this thing, you're gonna hurt Will. Now, while this is all going on in the lab, Nancy and Jonathan are busy trying to take that lab down. They've got the videotape all doctored, ready to go, watered down, of course, and they're about to send it out to news stations to blow this whole conspiracy up. The problem is, it's pretty late, and they're deciding that they probably should just stay at this guy's house. So the guy says, hey, why don't you just take my bedroom in there? And there's a pull-out couch there, but if I were you two kids, I would just get it over with because this is the worst-kept secret, you two. And they say, no, we're just friends. And he goes, yeah, that's the most unbelievable story I've heard all day. Sure enough, the two end up hooking up. About time. The next day, they have an awkward ride home, and when they get to Jonathan's house, they realize somebody's been there because there's Polaroids taken. And Jonathan says, I didn't shoot Polaroids. He didn't shoot them. The feds shot it, but we'll get to why they were in the house in a minute because the doctors have had a meeting and they're discussing what to do about this whole situation. This thing is spreading under Hawkins at a rapid rate, but when they try to burn it, which has been successful for them in the past, it ends up hurting Will. One of the doctors says, look, I know this is cold and callous, but if the kid dies, the kid dies. We got to keep this thing at bay. The main doctor does not like that idea at all, and while they're meeting, Joyce and Bob are outside, and they've decided they're not waiting anymore, so they try to barge in, and they try to get past two military police officers. And while they do this, Will ends up seeing the military police officers. He then turns to Mike and says, hey, I have an idea. And that idea is, have these guys go to my house and grab the map. And that is where the Polaroids take place. So they grab the map that he has drawn all over the place, and Will stands there and points to one spot and says, there. Whatever's there, he doesn't want me to see. So the feds and the doctors, they end up getting a team together, and they're going to send him out to that spot. Now, with all this going on, you've got Will at the hospital, Mike with Will. Lucas couldn't be reached, so Dustin had to deal with this whole Dart situation by himself. But he's ended up getting help from Steve Harrington, of all people. It's like another version of Lethal Weapon. Eventually, Lucas does end up finding out about the code red. He radios to Dustin, and Dustin says, hey, meet us at the junkyard ASAP. It's about Dart. So when this happens, Lucas goes to Max's house and says, hey, I finally have proof about what happened. You wanted proof? I have it. Follow me. They end up going to the junkyard, where Dustin and Steve have been leading a trail of meat to try to trap Dart. They put a huge pile of meat in the middle of the junkyard. They dump lighter fluid on it, and they fortified a school bus, and they're hoping to attract him there and hopefully kill him. Eventually, Dart ends up showing up, but he's not coming towards the meat. So Steve Harrington, being the hero that nobody wanted but the hero everybody needed, ends up going out, and he's going to try to lure Dart over to the pile of meat as like a human sacrifice. He flips Dustin the lighter and says, hey, be ready, and goes out there. And yeah, Dart's all about that. The problem is Dart's brought friends. All of a sudden, Steve Harrington is surrounded by a bunch of other Darts. They're like mini Demigorgons. And they attack, and Steve's able to get into the school bus, but at the last second, right before one of them is about to jump into the school bus and kill them all, they get called away by something. And Steve Harrington makes note of this by saying, hey, they're leaving for a reason. And that reason is all of those government soldiers have been lured to this one spot in the tunnels because Will told them to get there. And they're about to get slaughtered. Will is sitting in his hospital bed crying, saying, I'm so sorry, he made me do it. And when he says this, Mike ends up hearing it and knowing right away, oh my God, there was a spy. Mike tries to get the attention of the adults, but nobody wants to hear it. And of course, all of those soldiers are slaughtered. And right after they're slaughtered, the small Demigorgons all spread out and run away. Will then turns to his mom and says, we got to get out of here because they're coming. And sure enough, the episode ends with one of the Demigorgons reaching up out of that tunnel that Hopper and the doctor went down, and now they're in the lab. So we'll quickly move on to episode 7, which is the most forgettable episode of the season. 11 searches out her, quote, sister. Her sister is the girl from the room that 11 was in when her mom rushed in to grab her. She's also the girl who is featured in the opening scene of the second season. This girl, just like 11, has powers, and with a couple other people, they make people that hurt them pay, including people from the lab. They find one of the workers who says, hey, I was just doing my job, and by the way, the guy you call Papa is alive and well, and I can get you to him. And while 11 believes this story, the other girl does not. In the end, they're running from the cops, and the girl wants 11 to come with them, but 11 says, no, I can't. I have to get back to Hawkins, Indiana, because I have to help my friends who are in big trouble. So now that that's out of the way, let's go on to episode 8, which picks up right where episode 6 left off. The Demigorgons have breached the lab, but the doctor looks at Hopper and reassures him, hey, don't worry, the glass will hold. Unfortunately, it doesn't hold, and they break through. When they do this, the doctor hits a button that alerts the emergency system in the building, which lets Mike know that it's too late. So Mike runs in and says, we got to put Will to sleep. He's a spy. He can't see what we're doing. But Joyce is pretty reluctant to do this because Will keeps saying that Mike is lying over and over again. So just to make sure, Joyce looks at Will and says, who am I? And he has trouble remembering. That's a dead giveaway that it's no longer her son. And she says, all right, do it. And they put Will to sleep. So with Will knocked out, they grab him. And basically the whole group ends up hiding out in this master control room with the entire power out. You've got Will, Mike, Dr. Owens, Joyce, Hopper, and Bob all in this one place. And they're trying to figure out how the hell they're going to get out of here with all the doors locked. The problem, as Bob points out, is that, look, if you put the power back on, it's only going to put the power back on. You need to put the power back on and also go into the computer system and override the locks to unlock all the doors. Unfortunately for Bob, he's the only one that knows how to do this, so he volunteers, kind of. By the way, it's going to be really tough for him to do this because the entire place is covered with Demigorgons, and all the military police have been killed. Now, while that group tries to figure out how to get out of the lab, Nancy and Jonathan have arrived, and they're trying to figure out how to get in. They can clearly see that the lab is powerless, but lucky for them, they get some help out of the woods when Steve Harrington, Lucas, Max, and Dustin all pop out. They obviously stare at each other and say, what are you doing here? But when it becomes apparent that Will and Mike are in there, they let them know, hey, you might want to get them out because we had Demigorgons on us, they ran away, and we think they're now in there. But luckily for everybody, Bob has made it down there. He's overridden the system. He's unlocked all the doors. The issue is he's got a Demigorgon coming down on him. But Bob's a really smart guy. He turns the sprinkler system on, and it frees up the stairwell that Bob was going to use. The issue is Bob forgot to bring his gun. So Hopper grabs Will and Mike and Joyce and ends up bolting out of there. Dr. Owens has decided to stay and try to help Bob navigate through this lab to freedom. So it's looking like everything's going to end up working out for Bob, but at one point, a Demigorgon is literally around the corner, so Dr. Owens says, hey, get in this closet. And Bob does that. It looks like the Demigorgon walks by him, but when Bob leaves the closet to escape, he knocks over a broom, and when he does that, the Demigorgon hears it and starts chasing after Bob. Bob barely escapes from this Demigorgon, slamming the door, and as he's standing in the lobby staring at Joyce, out of nowhere, another Demigorgon attacks Bob. Hopper's trying to shoot that Demigorgon off Bob, but at this point, more Demigorgons have arrived, and they have to get the hell out of there. So Hopper grabs Joyce, says, look, he's too far gone. He's done. We gotta go, or else we're gonna be eaten. So folks, if you're drinking a glass of anything right now, pour one out for my man, Bob, who made the ultimate sacrifice. We'll have a moment of silence. Moment's over. So now everybody's back at Joyce's house trying to figure out how to take care of this thing, and they've come to the conclusion that to get rid of the small Demigorgons, you have to get rid of the big Demigorgon. The problem is that big Demigorgon is also in Will, and when you hurt the big Demigorgon, you hurt the small Demigorgons, you're going to hurt Will in the process. Well, Mike has the idea of just waking him up and asking him. The problem is he's a spy now, so we're just going to put him in a location that he doesn't know. They clear out a shack, and they put all of this stuff up to black it out. And when they wake up Will, he's just screaming over and over again, let me go, let me go, let me go. To try to get the actual Will out of there, Joyce starts telling him a memory that she has. And Jonathan follows up with a memory of his own, and Mike follows it up with a memory of his own. The problem is when they look at Will, he just says, let me go again. But Hopper notices something interesting about Will, and that's the fact that he keeps tapping. That tapping ends up being Morse code, and it's a message that he's saying, hey, I'm still in here. So luckily for them, they can still communicate with the actual Will while distracting the Demigorgon Will. They do this by just continuing to talk to Will, and sure enough, he gets a message out that says, close gate. Right as they find this out, the phone rings, and that triggers to Will where he is, which triggers the Demigorgon Will where they are, which sends upon them all of these small Demigorgons. So now they're all surrounded, they're in Joyce's house, and they're ready for all these Demigorgons to kind of come upon them. But all of a sudden, a Demigorgon jumps through the window, and they notice he's dead. They're all kind of in shock, but then they hear footsteps on the front porch. The latch unlocks by itself. The door swings open, and there she is. 11 is back. Some other minor details in episode 8. Dustin's kind of conceded defeat in the battle for Max. He flat out tells Lucas that, yeah, she's your girlfriend. And unfortunately, while I would love to date her, you can see that there's like sparks flying between you two. And then there's Billy, Max's older brother / stepbrother, who's getting ready to go out on a date, but the parents arrive back from wherever the hell they were. And they want to know where the hell Max is because Billy was supposed to be watching her. And he says, I don't know, she's 13, she's fine, she doesn't need a babysitter. And that's when you get a little background into why Billy might be such a dick, because his dad jacks him up, starts using just really inappropriate language, tells him basically that you're going to cancel whatever date you're going on and find your sister. And the dad gets really mad when Billy dares say that Max is not his sister, she's his stepsister. But on to the finale. 11 embraces Mike, and Mike gets really pissed off when he finds out that 11 was around the area the entire time. She was just being held up by Hopper. Hopper wants Mike to understand why he did this, but he doesn't. 11 says hi to everybody else in the group, but she's really standoffish when it comes to Max. She's actually flat out rude about it. So after all the pleasantries are out of the way, Joyce asks 11, do you know how to close this gate? You're kind of the one who opened it. And luckily for them, 11 does know how to close this gate. Problem is, if you close the gate, you kill all the Demigorgons, which in the process is going to kill Will. You obviously don't want to kill Will. And then the light bulb goes off. Will kept saying it likes it cold. And if you have a virus, which in this case Will does, it's the shadow monster, you want to make the host as uncomfortable for the virus as possible so the virus leaves. That means in this situation, making it as hot as possible so that hopefully whatever's in Will just exit and look for another host. So now they're going to take him somewhere where he's absolutely never been before, and that ends up being the cabin where 11 was hiding. They stuff this thing full of a bunch of electric heaters, and they set the fireplace up, and they're going to try to just sweat this thing out of them. So Joyce, Nancy, Jonathan, and Hopper, plus 11, all head to the cabin to clear it out, and then Hopper and 11 are going to head to the lab to close the gate. It's going to be tougher to do that, though, because the lab is still inhabited by tons of Demigorgons, and they're not going to let this go easily. So while they go off to save the day, you've got Dustin, Lucas, Steve Harrington, Max, and Mike all still at Joyce's house, basically on the sidelines. And they're trying to figure out how to help. Steve Harrington keeps saying, there's nothing you can do, let's just sit here. I can't have one of you kids dying on me, but they don't take no for an answer. And Mike has a great idea. What if we go to the hub of the tunnels and light it on fire? When we do this, the Shadow Monster is going to send all the Demigorgons there to stop who's ever doing that. That's going to lead all the Demigorgons to leave the lab and free it up for 11 to close the gate. By the time they arrive, we've already exited. 11 closes the gate, kills all of them, and we're home free. By the way, the hub of the tunnels is where all the soldiers were slaughtered when the Shadow Monster tricked them into going there. Steve Harrington, by the way, cannot stand this plan, but he's got bigger fish to fry as Billy has shown up at the house looking for Max. Steve Harrington and Billy have always had a contentious relationship because Steve Harrington was the big man on campus, and then Billy showed up, and he wants to be the alpha dog. So when Steve Harrington tries to jack up Lucas saying, stay away from Max, Steve Harrington gets a little pissed off that you just jacked up a 12-year-old and ends up in a fist fight with Billy. He puts up a good fight for a little bit, but Billy absolutely kicks the ever-loving shit out of him. He's got Steve Harrington mounted, and he's just wailing away, and that's when Max grabs a syringe full of the stuff that they used to put Will asleep and just injects him with it. So you've got Billy lying on the floor all groggy. Max is now holding the baseball bat that Steve Harrington had full of nails, and she says, stay away from me and my friends, or else. She also grabs Billy's car keys and says, all right, let's go. So now they have a way to the tunnels. But everybody's kind of waiting on word from the cabin to find out what happens with Will. When they turn all the heaters on, Will starts acting like he's dying because he is in legit pain, but he's in pain because of the Shadow Monster. To Joyce's credit, when this happens, she doesn't turn the heaters off like a mother usually would. The memory of Bob pops into her head, and she thinks, I don't want Bob to die in vain. She actually turns all the heaters up. When Joyce does this, you can see a change in Will. You can see literally the Shadow Monster coming out of Will. At one point, it gets so bad that Will ends up choking his mother, screaming, let me go, which prompts Nancy to grab a hot poker out of the fire and literally poke Will, burning him in the process, but also releasing Joyce from his grip. Shortly after this, the Shadow Monster does end up exiting Will and literally fleeing the cabin. So Will is now back to being Will, the Shadow Monster is looking for a new host, and 11 is freed up to close the gate. So as 11 and Hopper are walking through the lab trying to find the gate, they come across Dr. Owens, who's in bad shape. He's pretty close to the verge of death. He's been scratched up pretty badly by the Demigorgons. And Hopper wraps his belt around his leg to stop the bleeding, but also says, hey, by the way, this is 11. She's been living with me for about a year, and hopefully you can help her when you get better so she's not poked and prodded and can just be a regular kid. So Hopper's kind of done all he can for Dr. Owens, but he has to get this gate closed. He's going around corners with a gun, just making sure there's no Demigorgons that are going to attack him. And sure enough, when he gets to the actual gate, the gate is flooded with Demigorgons. But luckily for Hopper and 11, Mike's genius plan is in full effect. The kids found the main hub, they've lit it on fire, and when they did this, the Demigorgon has called all of his soldiers back, just like Mike had said he would. So this frees up 11 to close that gate. It literally takes everything out of 11 to get this portal closed. Normally, when she uses her power, she's bleeding out of one nostril. She's bleeding out of two this time. She's harnessing all of her energy to close this thing. At one point, the Shadow Monster even pops out of it to try and stop her, but it's not enough. 11 gets the portal closed, and when she does this, it kills all of the Demigorgons. So the kids end up making it out of the tunnel by the skin of their teeth, by the way, because they were surrounded by Demigorgons, but luckily the portal got closed. And now we fast forward to 1 month in the future. The lab has been shut down thanks to the tape that the investigative journalists sent to the news stations with the help of Jonathan and Nancy. And then you've got Hopper, who's having a meeting in a bar with Dr. Owens, who hands him a birth certificate for Jane Hopper. Hopper asks him, hey, how long before I can safely bring her out into the world? And the doctor says, yeah, if I were you, I'd wait probably about a year. Hopper knows that she's not really going to take too kindly to finding out this news. So Hopper says, hey, what about just 1 day? How much damage can be done if I bring her out for 1 day? And the doctor says, Not much, but what's with one day? Well, that one day ends up being the first middle school dance for these kids, and all the kids are getting ready. They're all pretty nervous, especially Dustin, who gets picked up by his boy Steve Harrington, who gave him some awesome hair advice, so he's ready to get after these ladies. So all the kids meet up, they go to the dance, and when this first slow dance happens, Lucas obviously gets matched up with Max. Some random girl pops up and says, "Hey, zombie boy, do you want to dance?" Mike is off being emo in the corner, and Dustin is getting shot down left and right by every girl he asks. Nancy Wheeler feels pity on him and ends up dancing with him, saying, "Hey, girls right now, they're stupid. Don't worry, in a couple years, you'll be a real killer." But as the police's Every Breath You Take blasts in the gymnasium, the doors open and in walks 11 dressed to the nines. Mike ends up telling her she looks beautiful. Do you want to dance? And they share a very awkward first kiss. But as they dance up top, in the upside down, the shadow monster is planning his comeback. And that is how season 2 of Stranger Things ends. All right, so here's the time where I beg you guys to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and look, if you didn't like the video, it's not a prerequisite that you have to hit the thumbs down. Like, you can just go about your way and find yourself down another Stranger Things hole. You don't have to hit the thumbs down. I would appreciate it, though, if you hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and, be nice in the comment section. And tell me what you're looking forward to most about Stranger Things Season 3.